All right, welcome in everyone. Today we're going to deep dive into this Executive Order 14202,
Okay.
issued by the President on February 6th, 2025. So very recent.
Yeah.
We're working with the text of the order itself,
Right.
straight from the Federal Register.
Mhm.
So no media spin on this. This is just the raw document.
Right.
And it's tackling, well, let's just say it's a hot button issue.
It is.
Allegations of anti-Christian bias within the U.S. government,
Yeah.
specifically during the previous administration.
Mhm.
So right off the bat, reading through this, one thing that struck me was how it frames this whole thing as like an attack on core American values. Like this is a fundamental
I see that.
that's under threat.
Absolutely. What's really interesting is how the order consistently brings up the Founding Fathers
Right,
and
yeah.
the First Amendment, really emphasizing the historical weight of religious freedom in the U.S.
Yeah, so it's not just like, oh, we're changing a policy here. It's like
Mhm.
this is a bedrock of our country,
Absolutely.
and it's under attack. And now, before we get too far into the weeds here,
Yeah.
I think it might be helpful for the listener if we just clarify, like, what even is an executive order?
Sure.
Because they get tossed around a lot, but it's not like the president making law, is it?
No, not exactly. Think of it more as like instructions from the president to federal agencies
Okay.
on how to carry out existing laws. They can't create new laws,
Right.
but they can definitely change how things work
I see.
in practice, on the ground. And in this specific order,
Yeah.
the real interesting part is that it sets up this whole new task force.
Right.
And that's where things, I think, get really, really kind of fascinating.
Yeah. The task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias,
Yeah.
that's not subtle.
Not at all. No.
Like, the name itself is already a statement.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned when we were prepping that the task force's makeup is important here.
Yes.
So who are these people?
It's a very high-level group, It's chaired by the Attorney General,
Mm-hmm.
and it includes officials from, all these major departments: state, treasury, defense.
Oh, wow.
Basically, these are folks with a lot of reach
Yeah.
across the entire government.
So it's not like some symbolic committee
Yeah.
tucked away in the basement
Yeah,
somewhere.
no, they have real power here.
This is serious.
Yes.
Okay, so what exactly are this task force's tasks as laid out in the order?
Well, their primary job is to examine all these government agencies,
Okay,
looking for policies or practices that they deem anti-Christian,
I see.
and then they recommend changes. It's basically like this government-wide audit
Oh, wow.
for this very specific kind of bias.
And if I'm reading between the lines here, anti-Christian bias is not really
Right.
like super clearly defined here.
No.
So red flag number one,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yes.
But okay, let's stick with what the order actually does for now.
Okay.
What else is the task force supposed to do besides investigating things?
Well, they're also tasked with developing strategies to protect religious freedom more broadly,
Okay.
sharing information with relevant groups.
Mhm.
They can even solicit input from all sorts of people.
So it's not just about finding bad practices. It's about shaping policy moving forward.
Exactly, yeah. It's got that proactive element to it as well.
Okay. And they have to report regularly to the president, culminating in a final report when they're dissolved.
Right.
This isn't meant to be like a temporary thing, is it?
I don't think so.
This is-
It definitely points towards a more lasting shift
Yeah.
in how the government approaches religious freedom,
Oh.
or at least, how they view threats to Christianity specifically.
Which is where things get really tricky, I think. Because the order claims a pattern of targeting peaceful Christians
Yes.
under the previous administration.
Yeah.
And it even cites some examples,
Well, to the
which you
defense.
pulled out a few
Right.
for me earlier.
Yes.
What are some of the ones that stand out to you?
Well, one that really jumps out is the prosecution of pro-life activists. Specifically, it mentions a Catholic priest
Mm-hmm.
and a 75-year-old grandmother who were given these really lengthy prison sentences.
Wow.
And the order really emphasizes that a current president pardoned these
Right.
individuals, like it's proof of this alleged targeting.
That's a pretty loaded way to frame it.
It is.
And you mentioned the order also brings up the violence against Catholic churches
Yeah.
and pro-life centers,
Mhm.
claiming that like the previous administration just didn't pay enough attention to it.
Right. It mentions a House resolution condemning the violence,
Okay.
but, the implication is that the previous administration just wasn't doing enough.
Like if they weren't taking it seriously enough.
Yeah, like it's building this case, right,
Yeah.
to justify this really drastic action.
And then there's that whole thing with the FBI memo,
Right.
labeling some Catholics as potential domestic terrorists,
Yes.
which, even though it was retracted, it obviously feeds into this whole narrative that the order is trying to create.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Kind of weaving together all these different incidents,
Mm-hmm.
some very controversial,
Right.
to paint this picture of like a systematic problem
Right.
that needs this really, really forceful response.
Yeah.
So, all right, we've laid out what this order is trying to do,
Right.
but does it work?
Yeah.
And more importantly, like, what are the unintended consequences?
Okay.
That's what we got to get into.
Yeah. Lots to unpack there.
Lots to unpack.
Definitely.
That's where we'll pick up
Okay.
after, well, not after a break because we're just going to keep going.
That sounds good.
But that's where we'll pick up next.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so we've established this executive order wants to tackle what it calls anti-Christian bias in the U.S. government. But as I was reading through this thing, the language just seems so broad to me.
Yeah.
Like, what even is anti-Christian bias
Right.
in a practical sense?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The order doesn't really give us a concrete definition,
Right.
which honestly opens the door for a lot of interpretation.
Yeah.
And maybe even abuse.
You and I were talking about this before we started recording, and you mentioned, like, some potential legal challenges this vagueness could lead to.
Absolutely.
What are some of those?
Well, imagine, right? You have a government agency and they're promoting some policy
Okay.
that maybe clashes with certain Christian values, but it wasn't intentionally targeting Christians.
Right.
Could that be seen as anti-Christian bias under this order?
It's really murky.
It is. It's a huge gray area.
So something like, I don't know, a public health campaign encouraging vaccination,
Right.
which some religious groups might have objections to.
Exactly. Yeah.
Could that be challenged under this framework?
Potentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly the kind of scenario where this lack of clarity becomes really problematic. And critics of this order are arguing that it could have a chilling effect on all sorts of government activity, even stuff that has absolutely no intention of suppressing religion.
And this kind of feeds into a bigger concern that you brought up earlier, which is that this whole thing could end up favoring one religion over others.
Right.
I mean, we have the separation of church and state in the Constitution.
Right.
So how does this executive order even square with that?
It's a very tricky balance, right? The folks who support this order would say, well, this isn't about putting Christianity above other religions.
Okay.
It's about correcting a wrong. It's about protecting a group that's been unfairly targeted.
But if you're only focusing on anti-Christian bias,
right,
and not, bias against other faiths, doesn't that kind of imply that there is a hierarchy?
That's exactly what the critics are saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really raises questions about how this task force is actually going to operate in practice.
Right.
Will they even consider claims from other religious groups?
Right.
What about discrimination within Christian denominations, like against LGBTQ plus individuals who are also Christian?
These are big questions.
Yeah.
And the order doesn't even seem to touch them.
No, not really.
In your notes, you mentioned that this executive order could actually have implications far beyond just religious groups.
It could.
How so?
Well, think about it. Anywhere the government interacts with people's beliefs, healthcare, education, social services, this order could really shift the balance of power.
Okay, give me a concrete example.
Sure.
How could this impact something like, say, healthcare policy?
Okay, well, let's take reproductive rights.
Yeah.
Something you highlighted as an area of interest. Could this mean that healthcare providers who have certain religious beliefs could refuse to perform certain procedures based on conscience claims, even if those procedures are perfectly legal and medically necessary?
So So this could actually impact someone's access to healthcare
It could.
based on the beliefs of the provider, not the patient.
Yeah, that's one way you could interpret this.
Wow.
And that's just healthcare. Think about education. Curriculum choices might be challenged.
Right.
Social services, funding for certain programs could be impacted.
So this order really does open up a Pandora's box.
I think so, yeah.
It's not just about like abstract legal principles. This is about people's lives.
Absolutely.
Their access to essential services, their ability to exercise their own beliefs and rights.
Right. And that's why it's so important for everyone to understand this order and what it could mean. It doesn't matter what your faith is or your political leanings. This is going to affect a lot of people.
And that's what this deep dive is for.
Yeah,
right? To give you, the listener, the tools to understand all this.
Absolutely.
But there's one final question I want to pose here before we wrap up. How do we really ensure religious freedom for everyone in a society that's becoming more diverse and less religiously affiliated overall? How do we do that while also maintaining that separation of church and state?
That is the fundamental challenge, isn't it?
It is.
And this executive order, I mean, it's trying to address a very specific concern.
Yeah.
But it also raises a ton of new questions about that very balance.
Right.
And honestly, this is a debate that goes way beyond this one document.
It's a debate we all need to be a part of.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, we'd like to leave you with a few suggestions on where to go from here. We've covered a lot of ground with this executive order 14202. But really the goal of this whole deep dive is to give you, the listener, the tools to kind of go further on your own.
Exactly. This order is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, you know?
Right.
This puzzle about the future of religious freedom in America.
Right. And to really understand it, we need to look beyond just this one document.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that our listeners specifically highlighted concerns about the impact on LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Where could they go to learn more about that potential intersection?
Well, there are a number of organizations that are really tracking this issue closely.
Okay.
The ACLU, for example, they've been very vocal about how this order could be used to actually erode LGBTQ plus protections.
Okay.
They see it as part of a broader attack on minority rights.
Okay.
So their website would be a good place to start.
So that's more for like the legal analysis side of things.
Yeah, and you know, for following ongoing developments.
Okay.
On the other side of the debate, you know, we talked about how groups who are supporting the order see it as this necessary step to protect religious freedom.
Right. Where could someone find those perspectives?
Well, a group called the Alliance Defending Freedom.
Okay.
They're a pretty prominent legal organization.
Okay.
And they've really championed this executive order.
I see.
Their argument is that it restores a proper balance between religious freedom and government overreach.
Okay.
They have a ton of resources on their website, you know, laying out their arguments and some case studies as well.
So we've got these two like very different interpretations of this order and what it could mean.
Right.
It's really important to engage with both sides.
Absolutely.
You know, understand their reasoning, look at the evidence.
Exactly, yeah. Don't just take our word for it.
Right.
Go read the full text of the order yourself.
Right.
It's available online, and it's actually written in pretty plain language.
Great.
So, you know, see what stands out to you.
And beyond the order itself, I mean, just follow the news, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
See how it's actually being implemented, what cases are being brought forward, how different groups are reacting.
Yeah, this is a story that's still unfolding, you know.
Right. Another avenue that you mentioned that might be interesting, especially based on our listeners' initial questions, was looking at historical parallels.
Right.
Like, were there other times in U.S. history where the government stepped in to protect specific religious groups?
Yeah, I mean, how did those situations play out?
Right.
History can give us some really valuable context for understanding these present day challenges.
And finally, I mean, don't be afraid to talk about this. Right?
No, please talk about it.
Discuss it with your friends, your family, colleagues, whoever.
These are complicated issues.
Yeah.
There's no easy answers.
And that's kind of the whole point of this deep dive, right? To empower you, the listener.
Yeah.
To keep exploring, keep questioning, and forming your own informed opinions.
Because ultimately, the future of religious freedom in this country depends on us understanding and being committed to these fundamental principles.
So we hope that this deep dive has given you the tools to navigate this really complex and always evolving landscape.
It's a lot.
Thanks for joining us.
And keep diving deeper.
Keep diving deeper.